The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Mark Mather with Population Reference Bureau. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar on accessing American Indian and Alaska Native data from the ACS, opportunities and challenges. I'm very pleased to introduce our two panelists for the webinar today. We have Dr. James Taylor, who is a senior special counsel with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And then we have Zanna Berg, who's director of Kids Count for the Montana Budget and Policy Center. We also have several staff from the Census Bureau on the call today, and they will be available if needed during the Q&A. As always with these webinars, we're going to save the questions until the end, but if you do have a question, you can type it into the question box in your webinar control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen there. And this webinar is being recorded, so if you need to leave early, you'll be able to access the recording online. You should receive an email with a link to that recording sometime in the next few days. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Jim. You should get a little pop-up message there.
Thanks so much, Mark. And everyone, thank you for joining us. Just bear with me for 1 second as I start the presentation. I just want to begin by saying that the ACS is one of the kind of great unknown tools that we frequently take for granted, but it really amounts to so much of what we do for litigation, for civil rights enforcement, for appropriations. And so for that reason, we really thought it would just be good to kind of give a brief overview of what the ACS is, how it's conducted, just some of the tools that you would use to access the ACS data. And then most of what I'm going to focus on will be on the challenges to getting an accurate ACS count in Indian country for urban natives, and then some of the ways that we are working and partnering with the Census Bureau to help overcome those challenges. And so as we begin, this just gives you an overview. To remind you, this is an ongoing nationwide survey. It's different from the decennial census, which is conducted every 10 years, in that this is conducted all of the time. Some people think, oh, is it just sent out once a year? No, it's actually sent out every month of the year, and it's sent out to a sample, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And you can see that it covers a much broader number of topics. It really kind of drills down into topics a lot more than the decennial census does. And this gives you an idea of how many topics are covered. You can see so many of these, whether it's social, we use a lot of the social data for purposes of civil rights enforcement for research. A lot of this is actually used for federal grant programs. Housing, especially, it's the same thing. A lot of federal housing grants are based on this. Economics, and then of course the demographics, which allows us to break it down, not only to identify those who are American Indian, Alaska Native, but also their gender and their age, and where they're located. This gives you an idea of the products that are available. There used to be 3-year estimates that were available, but those no longer are, as of I believe it was 2011. And so really for much of Indian country, what we're going to really be focusing on are either the 1-year supplemental estimates or the 5-year estimates. And the reason is because you can see the 1-year estimates require populations with 65,000 or more, and that's usually just too large of a population size to really be relevant to much of Indian country, which has much more sparsely populated areas. But you can see the supplemental estimates are 20,000, and then the 5-year estimates are available for all areas. Again, this just gives you kind of an idea of when you might use one over the other, but much of what we're going to talk about for a good portion of Indian country really is the supplemental and especially the 5-year estimates. This gives you an idea for the ACS 1-year estimates, supplementals. The areas, it's much more limited. The areas in blue reflect all of those areas in Indian country where they're really available. And so you can see it really doesn't cover many tribal areas. And the key about this is that the decennial actually surveys every household in the United States. The ACS is a sample. And what that means is that the Census Bureau is only surveying a small percentage of households each year, And then over the course of, whether it's over a course of like a 5-year period, they'll aggregate that data to give us estimates for that 5-year period. But you can see that each year, roughly 3.5 million households out of 130 million are surveyed, and that amounts to roughly about 2.7%. And the key with this is that if you aggregate that over a rolling 5-year period, it means that roughly about 13.5% of all US households will be surveyed. And then, of course, there's a portion of those households that may not respond. So we're typically looking at over a 5-year period that the sample covers roughly about 12% of US households. Now, that also raises the question of how is it that people get fortunate enough to be selected? I will tell you that in all the years that the ACS has been conducted, our household received a survey for the very first time last year. And as one of our partners who works on ACS likes to say, and I agree with this assessment, you should view getting the ACS survey like winning the lottery, because you are one of the chosen few from your community or from your tribe or from your Alaska Native village who's actually being asked to speak really for your household to kind of reflect how the Census Bureau estimates your whole community is. And that's why it's really important that everyone fill it out. And that's why much of the emphasis that we're doing now, a lot of the partnering organizations that work with the Census Bureau, has shifted from get out the count efforts in the decennial to getting out the counts for the ACS, because it's really vital that we get as many people who are being sampled to fill out the survey as possible. This just gives you a brief overview of what it is that you get. I will say that the ACS survey, you can actually get the whole survey online. It will give you all 44 questions. They also do a very good job of going through and explaining why it is that each one of those 44 questions is asked. There is a very good reason behind every one of them. Now you see that the Census Bureau estimates it takes an average of 40 minutes to complete the survey questionnaire. But what I will say is that because much of Indian country, we may be dealing with larger households, or we may be dealing with households that have limited English proficiency. They may need to receive the survey and be surveyed in their native tongue. And that typically will take longer. But again, it's really, really important that every question be answered and answered accurately. One of the most important questions is the question about race. And the reason why person one, I'm emphasizing this one, is person number one, oftentimes it's the basis for determining who is the head of household, what race is the head of household. And you can see the third box from the top, American Indian or Alaska Native, and then it says print name of enrolled or principal tribe. You can actually print in more than one tribe. It's a good idea to list whichever tribe you affiliate with the most in the number one position. But if you, in fact, it's very common that people may affiliate with 2 or more tribes, you can list those, and the Census Bureau can actually capture that information as well. This raises the question of who is it that counts as an American Indian or Alaska Native. These are somewhat outdated standards because the federal government has not updated them since 1997, but it's something that we anticipate that the Federal Interagency Working Group and the Census Bureau will be taking up with the Office of Management and Budget in the very near future. But you can see, again, it's people who indicate their race is American Indian or Alaska Native, or they identify a tribe, or if they report certain entries that would indicate that they are American Indian or Alaska Native. There are 3 ways that I want to just mention briefly that you can access much of the census information. My tribal area, and I've given the link at the top, you'll be able to access these slides as well, is a really good tool to use because it really does a good job of summarizing information that sometimes can be a little more difficult to find if you use the next tool. For people who are a little more adept and a little more skilled, or have attended some of the Census Bureau's webinars, I would encourage you to use data.census.gov. It allows you to access in a more advanced fashion the data, and I use it all of the time for the work that I do. The final thing that I want to mention just briefly is that NCAI's Policy Research Center also does a really good job of boiling down the information. And again, they're taking census information that's already available through the other 2 sources that I mentioned, but they can do it in a much more accessible format. And oftentimes, if you can't get a question answered right away from the Census Bureau, the folks at the Policy Research Center also are available to help. So I'm going to spend just the next 5 minutes going through some of the challenges, and there are many challenges that we're seeing with the ACS. This just gives you an overview, and I will go through each one of these just briefly, because as you can see, there are quite a few. One of the biggest challenges that, and this isn't just unique to the American Indian Alaska Native population, it's really true for many populations, is that there have been declining ACS response rates over the last few years. Some of this, especially the deep drop that you see in 2020, is directly related to the pandemic. But again, this is a trend that we need to reverse. Now, the undercount that I have listed here is actually from the decennial census, but I mention it because, again, where you have an undercount in a survey that's measuring every household in the United States, you can anticipate that there are going to be very similar sorts of undercounts that you will see with the ACS. So that's another thing that we really have to be aware of. And just as you can see, there are typically three primary communities of color or populations of color that have experienced these undercounts over time: Black population, the Latino population, and the American Indian Alaska Native living off reservation. The other piece of this is young children. Young children typically are a very difficult group to count. There are a number of reasons for that. Oftentimes people may forget about a newborn, or it may be that if there is an account of a household, there's a reliance on administrative records that may be for a tax year in which new children were not yet listed because they had not yet been born. But again, because the American Indian population is a much younger population, having an undercount of young children also is a challenge that we really see in Indian country. It's also true that we see this particularly in Indian country, that you tend to see an overcount of populations that are homeowners, but you will see an undercount, and you can see the undercount in the 2020 decennial was about 1.5% of people who rent. And again, part of that's not just related to where they live or the fact that they don't own it. A lot of it's also tied to the socioeconomics, because people who own their homes tend to have more be a little on firmer financial footing than those who rent. And also you find that people who own their homes tend to be in a more stable environment where they may not be moving around as much. So it's a little easier to count them. Now, some of the more specific challenges that we see in Indian country, there's historically a distrust of the federal government, really all non-tribal governments. And this is something that we've really had to contend with, and we have to recognize it, and also recognize and acknowledge that there are very real and legitimate reasons why that distrust exists. And that's why so much of what we do in working with the Census Bureau is to find trusted partners and trusted messengers from each community to work with people to make sure they fill out their census form. The other issue that we oftentimes see is with the survey itself. The survey is long, 44 questions is a lot of information. And the other piece of this is a lot of the questions, people view them as very intrusive. They may ask about things that people find embarrassing questions to answer, about how much education do you have? How much money do you make? Do you have running water? Do you have electricity? Do you have access to transportation? Many of those questions can be very, very embarrassing for people to answer. Part of this also is data sovereignty. This really comes more into play when we're talking about administrative records that the Census Bureau uses to help, to basically help fill in the gaps where some of the ACS surveys are not received or incomplete. And it's something, again, that the Census Bureau has done a really good job in recent years of working out and reaching out to NCAI and to tribal nations and governments to really try to overcome this so that they can come up with a way to protect the privacy and the sovereignty of the data, while still trying to get what oftentimes is much more accurate tribal data to fill in those gaps. The ACS faces one of the most significant problems or challenges in Indian country is that it's a sample, and much of Indian country is much more sparsely populated, especially much more sparsely populated than urban areas. If you have a village of 100 people, we'll use 100 households. 100 households with 400 people, you may have only 3 households in the entire year that are receiving that survey. And if you don't get responses back from those 3 households, it really can have a much greater impact on the accuracy of the data and the estimates for that community than you would get if you had someone who lived in an urban population, which has a much larger population where you have the same household not responding. So it's really important that we get those responses. I just want to flag this. This isn't an issue yet, but there's been a lot of concern about differential privacy. It's not scheduled to be applied to ACS data until 2025, but in between now and then, we expect that the Census Bureau is going to continue to engage in tribal consultations and outreach, again, for purposes of making sure that that balance is struck between keeping data private, but also having accurate data that we can use. Language access is another big barrier. This just shows you the most recent determinations under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. It's not surprising that you see so many of those states that you have a number of county level or boroughs or villages that are covered for native languages. This identifies the specific languages. I will note that the 51 that you see for all other American Indian tribes, most of those are for the Ho-Chunk Nation in Wisconsin, and it's actually a very small number of people who speak it. But you see a lot of other languages like Choctaw, Navajo, and Yupik that are spoken by large numbers of people, thousands of people. I'm going to mention just briefly the lack of broadband, and I have the slide in here twice just to highlight this. So the first slide, you see where the reservations are located. And then the next slide, the yellow is bad. Yellow means that it's an area that doesn't have access to broadband. And you can see it's most of remote Alaska, and it's most of the same areas in the lower 48 on the reservations. I'm just going to switch back. So you can see there's a very strong correlation between the two. And there's a similar correlation in terms of non-traditional addresses. The areas that you see in tan, again, they largely overlap with tribal areas, and those are areas that have rural route addresses, post office boxes, and other non-traditional addresses. The reason why that matters is because the Census Bureau has a much greater difficulty, and they don't really have the capability of mailing out all of the census information to these non-traditional addresses. And that's why so much of what you see in Indian Country and the remote Alaska operations are direct in-person communications that the Census Bureau enumerators will have. The pandemic has been a huge issue, and I'm just going to briefly go over it in a minute. This will give you an idea. These, again, are findings that the Census Bureau itself made. It's not surprising the pandemic significantly affected the 2020 census, and it was such a big issue that the Census Bureau ultimately had to decide not to release standard 2021 year estimates. And the next slide will show why. The red X's and those yellow dashes are bad because it means that there were either no activities or incomplete activities. And you can see that there was a large gap in 2020 when a lot of the information in the ACS operations simply weren't able to take place because of the pandemic. And again, this just illustrates what the impact was on the response rates. You can see in April and June of 2020, there were no surveys mailed. And overall for the year, it was a 71% response rate, which was the lowest in the history of the ACS, again, because of those challenges. I'm going to mention that, especially for those of you who may be at NCAI next week, but even if you're not, please reach out, whether it's to me or to folks at the Census Bureau. We have a current need in Alaska that we are working and coordinating with the Alaska Federation of Natives and census staff to fill, because there are some of these issues that we're seeing, that we saw in the 2020 ACS, we're actually seeing in remote Alaska operations this year. And as I close it out with the last couple of slides, I just want to really kind of emphasize ways in which all of you can participate and help us and help the Census Bureau in its activities. One is the expanded partnerships. A lot of this with ACS is really increased education and outreach because a lot of people don't know what the ACS is or why it's so important. And then the other piece of it is to really make sure that it's accessible in all native languages. We have a monthly Natives Count census group that meets, and I would encourage you, if you're interested, please feel free to email me. My email information will be at the end. All are welcome, and we use this as a forum to really exchange information and best practices, and as well as have speakers from the Census Bureau that give us updates that help us help the Census Bureau get a better count in the ACS and in its other surveys. And then the final set of slides, I just want to emphasize, there are 3 particular initiatives that the Census Bureau has undertaken that have been really effective for outreach. Many of you already know Dee Alexander of the Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs. Dee is wonderful. Her contact information is there. The second piece is that the Census Bureau just last fall created the Office of Strategic Alliances. Much of their focus is really on businesses and integrating businesses with helping in outreach and communications, but they're also coordinating very closely with field and with all of us in trying to improve the counts for ACS and other surveys. And then the final piece that we're really excited about is the Census Bureau has evergreened, in other words, made permanent, a very effective program that it had from the decennial field operations. So we now have permanent tribal relations specialists who are full-time staff at the Census Bureau. There are going to be 4. You can see there's a 4th specialist, TBA, who will be operating out of the Chicago office in blue. That individual is actually in the process. We understand that they are in the process of making a final hiring determination, and we expect that there will be an announcement soon for them. But the other 3, many of whom you may know, are people who have already been working for the census in the 2020 census. We have Jessica Imatishi, who is working at the LA office. And then we're very fortunate to have Shadana Sultan. And again, you can see their contact information. And Charles Tipikonik, both working out of the Denver office. And again, we're really, really excited to have them. The bottom line with all of this is we're trying to make sure that natives count in all census surveys. We'll hold questions for later. My contact information is there. And with that, I am going to stop and turn the slides back over to Mark.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. And as Jim said, we are going to hold the Q&A until the end. So I want to give Zana a chance to go through her presentation. Zana, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter. You should get a pop-up there in a moment.
Alrighty, thanks so much for having me today. Again, my name is Zana Berg, and I lead the Kids Count work in Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. So at Kids Count, we compile and analyze data on children's well-being, and we help stakeholders and policymakers understand and use that data to inform better policies and programs. So in the 3-state region that we work, it's home to 20 federally recognized tribal nations. So we're always thinking about opportunities and limitations of data for tribal communities and American Indian people. So I'm very much more on the practical, like user side of the American Community Survey. So I'm just going to share a small piece today of what I've learned throughout the process of working with available data. I'm on this learning journey with everyone else though, and there are nuances with the data that I'm not going to be able to cover today, but I do hope to provide a few resources and just provide some information that I've learned along the way. So one way to think about using ACS data for tribal communities is to think about disaggregating data by racial groups. And there are some nuances to the race groupings that are worth mentioning to start off our discussion. So when somebody fills out the ACS, and I know Jim kind of shared what the form actually looks like, they have the option to list multiple race categories that they fit into, and they're not confined to just picking one race. However, when data is reported back in the tables to us, it's often reported as 7 distinct racial groups. So 6 of those groups are for people who identify as one race group alone, and then there's a 7th group for anyone that marks multiple races. So let's go through an example to see kind of how this plays out. So I have this little Venn diagram as an example of a person who identifies both as American Indian and white. So in the groupings on the left that are distinct groupings, they're classified into the 2 or more races category. Another way to consider racial groupings, though, is to use non-distinct groupings. So in this case, we would include someone who is American Indian alone or in combination with some other race. So in our Venn diagram example, this individual would fit into 2 groups. The first group would be American Indian alone or in combination, and then white alone or in combination. So when we think about these racial groupings and why it's important to think about distinct groups versus non-distinct groups, if we take Montana for an example, it's a small group of people who have that overlap. So in Montana, there's a population of just over 1 million people. 6% of the population in Montana identifies as American Indian and Alaska Native as their only race. And this 6% percentage is the percentage that's often reported or often thought of when asked what percentage of people living in Montana are American Indian. But if we think about this American Indian alone or in combination grouping, there are just over 22,000 people that identify as American Indian and some other race category. So in total in Montana, there's about 8% of the population that's American Indian as one of their racial identities. Again, it's a small group, but I think it's worth mentioning for a couple of reasons. One is, if we look at data from the census, the group of people who identify as American Indian in combination with another race is growing, at least in Montana. So in 2020, this in combination group made up 3% of the Montana population. And if we only ever look at race as a distinct group, we may be missing people who don't fit neatly into our categories, but still make up the fabric of our communities. So there are pros and cons for using the default distinct categories. One of them is that you need distinct groups in order to make statistical comparisons. And it's a standardized way to compare groups over time. But by using these distinct groups, just keeping in mind that we're often missing the nuances of racial identity and how that plays out in our communities, or how that's changing over time. So disaggregating data by race is an important way to look at data for American Indian populations. I also want to touch on different geographies that we may be interested in looking at data for as well. So there are a lot of details that I won't cover, but they're covered in many different resources from the Census Bureau. So I have one of those resources linked here. It's a handbook that kind of goes through the different geographies that I'll touch just briefly on. Some of these specific geographies only apply to certain states, and so we're not going to go in depth into those. But in general, there are two main categories of geographies that data is available related specifically to American Indian and Alaska Native areas. So the first main category are legal entity boundaries. And these include Alaska Native regional corporations, American Indian reservations, and American Indian off-reservation trust lands. So in addition to the legal boundaries, there are also statistical entities that help us dig into data at a more nuanced level. So these statistical entities include the Alaska Native Village Statistical Areas, the Oklahoma Tribal Statistical Areas, Tribal Designated Statistical Areas, and Tribal Tracts and Tribal Block Groups. Again, a lot of details that we're not going to go into for each of these, but I do want to just go through an example of how this plays out for one tribal nation in Montana. So in Montana, there are 8 tribal nations that are located within the same geographic boundaries as the state of Montana. We're going to look at the Blackfeet Nation as an example and see what geographies are available to look at data for this area. So to orient us on the map that we're looking at an area in northern Montana. To the west is the border of Glacier National Park, and to the north is Canada. All of the outlined blue sections on the map make up the Blackfeet Reservation. So the first geography that I'll mention is county. So the Blackfeet Reservation boundaries overlap with 2 counties in Montana, Glacier County and Pend Oreille County. So looking at data by county can give us some insight into the population living in this area and on the Blackfeet Reservation. But you'll notice that the boundaries do not line up perfectly. So the next smallest geographic boundary that we can look at is data specifically for the Blackfeet Reservation. And when we're looking at a data table, the way we would find this is to look for the geography named Blackfeet Indian Reservation and Off-Reservation Trust Land. So that's going to give us information for the full blue outline. And then there's one more smaller geography that we can look at for this specific area. So the Blackfeet Reservation is subdivided into 3 tribal census tracts. And these are what's shown in the 3 different shades of blue on the map. So these tribal census tracts, they're defined by the Census Bureau in cooperation with tribal officials, and they provide meaningful and relevant data for smaller geographic areas. So for example, if we look at these 3 different shades of the tribal census tracts, the light blue tract makes up Census Tract 3. And you'll notice that it's the smallest in terms of geographic space that it takes up, but it actually has the largest population. So the town of Browning, Montana is located in that light blue area. So this census tract in particular helps us understand populations within the reservation even further by grouping those in Browning separately from those who live in the more rural parts of the area. So looking at these same geographies, but with population data next to them, we can see how different geographies capture different parts of the population living in these areas. So if we just look at the highlighted boxes down at the bottom, the total American Indian population in those highlighted boxes, we can see that Glacier County has about 2/3 of the population that identifies as American Indian alone or in combination, compared to Pend Oreille County only has 18%. If we look at the column to the right of that, looking only at the reservation, overall, the reservation has 81% of the population as American Indian. But if we look at the 3 census tracts, we're picking up more nuance. So Browning, the town we were just talking about in Census Tract 3, is made up of a population that is 94% American Indian, where Tribal Census Tract 2, which makes up the northern part of the reservation, has 62% of the population as American Indian. So again, just picking up different nuances as we look at different geographies within this area. So combining our first topic of racial groupings and then also thinking about tribal geographies, my one big takeaway from my portion of the talk is that data for geographies that represent tribal areas are not the equivalent of describing data for the American Indian and Alaska Native population. So there are people who live in reservation geographies who are not American Indian. So geography is not the same as characterizing a racial group. So the last piece that I'll share today is an example of how ACS data may lack context in tribal communities. So one example of this is the ACS provides data on health insurance coverage for different populations. There are 7 different types of health insurance captured in the ACS. So there are 3 different types of private health insurance and 3 different types of public health insurance. And so those 3 and 3, so 6 total, if you identify having any of those 6, you count as having health insurance coverage. Someone who responds to the ACS can also mark that they receive medical care from the Indian Health Service, or IHS. People with only IHS coverage are not considered to be insured because coverage is not always comprehensive. So IHS coverage is not always comprehensive because the federal government has failed to honor the trust and treaty promises to tribal nations to provide health services by the federal government chronically underfunding the IHS, and that limits the services that they're able to provide. So if we look at the data in Montana, the total population without health insurance is 8.4%. For the American Indian population living in Montana, 26% are uninsured. And this is a statistically significantly higher uninsured rate for American Indian people who live in Montana. There's more to the story because this one data point alone cannot tell us how many of the 26% are accessing IHS, but just don't meet the definition of healthcare coverage. So more insightful data might be, so there's about 16,000 American Indian people who live in Montana that fall into that 26% with no health insurance. And if we look specifically at that group of 16,000, we see that 91% utilize IHS and 9% do not utilize IHS. So if we're thinking about policy recommendations, a good recommendation might be better funding for IHS so that more comprehensive services can be provided. The reason why that is a good policy recommendation is because based on the data, it's going to reach the majority of American Indians without health insurance in Montana. But the data does show us that there is still 9% without health insurance from private or public sources and without utilizing services from IHS. So we could ask additional questions of the data to understand, policy or supports needed to reach the 9%. So where in Montana does the 9% live? Is it in urban settings where IHS might not be available? So again, just thinking about how that one data point might not tell the full story. And so digging into data through iPhones can help us understand a little bit more about this. Some other ideas about how to tell more of that narrative, if one data point from an ACS table doesn't do the whole narrative justice, is to think about how to supplement some of the ACS data with administrative data. So for example, is there data from Medicaid, from our state agency that we can look at to see where Medicaid, where there are people who are eligible but not enrolled in Medicaid? And if we can look at that by race. Another option might be to think about qualitative data and how to bring in voices from communities to better understand how to interpret the data. So with that, I'll kind of close my part of the conversation. I just want to say thank you to the organizers for hosting this webinar and the chance to learn from each other on such an important topic.
Great, thanks very much, Sana. As a reminder, if you have questions, there's a question box in your control panel and you can type those questions into that question box. We do have a few questions that have come in, but as I mentioned, we have a few staff members from the Census Bureau who have joined the webinar today, and I wanted to pause to see if any of our Census Bureau colleagues had any reactions or anything they wanted to say in response to Jim and Xana's presentations. And so you've all been made panelists, I think, and so you should be able to unmute yourself using the just clicking the little microphone button in your control panel there. Okay, well, we will jump right into questions then, but feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to respond to any of the questions that have come in. So the first question is, does the ACS survey include any information about the unhoused population like they do, like the decennial census provides some information for those who are unhoused? Does Jim or Xana, do either of you?
I was going to defer to the census experts on the line. I do know the answer to the second one. I'm sorry.
This is Charles.
Like I'm getting a little feedback.
Hello, this is Charles Tipiconic with the Census Bureau.
Hi, Charles.
Tribal Relations Specialist.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm having some technical difficulties. As well. I didn't hear that last question. Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, so the question is, does the Census Bureau's ACS survey include any information about the unhoused population? I guess those who might be experiencing homelessness, like the decennial census does.
Yes, I'm not aware that that's one of the questions asked, so I don't think it does include that. But I will check and get back with Jim on answer, but I'm not aware of those 44 questions that he mentioned, if one of them is homelessness.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Ken Turner. I'm also with the Census Bureau in our ACS branch field division. And we're responsible primarily for data collection in the field. So some of the questions I've seen in the chat are more for subject matter experts, but I can address the one that is listed here about the unhoused populations. We don't have a special operation to capture people that may be outside of shelters, but through our group quarters survey, we do capture some people who may be experiencing homelessness in homeless shelters.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's helpful. Someone asked a question about the My Tribal Area app. They wondered if that included just ACS data, or does it also include 2020 census data?
That is ACS data. This is Charles again.
Okay. And Lillian, maybe if you have a minute, Lillian's my PRB colleague, if you could put in a link in the chat to that My Tribal Area app. I think people would find that very useful as a starting point if you're looking for data for your geographic areas.
Yeah, that
Mark,
Charles again. Yeah, that is a tool that's available publicly at census.gov, but also for our tribal partners, as one of our responsibilities as a tribal specialist is to offer training to any of our tribal partners to learn how to navigate our census website and to find that data that you're looking for. So I'll include my contact information, and it was included on Jim's slides, but please contact either myself or any of the other tribal specialists if you'd like to schedule a training session, either virtually or in person, and we'll be glad to set that up for you and teach you how to navigate and find the specific tribal data that you're looking for. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
And Mark, I wanted to add one thing, because I think the question also asked if it would utilize, if My Tribal Area incorporated 2020 census data. The best way to do that, if you want to get data quickly, it isn't in My Tribal Area, but it is in QuickFacts. QuickFacts is kind of a mixture of both ACS and decennial data, and it actually identifies what the data source is. So that's another tool. But what I will say is that the My Tribal Area is really, really easy to use. And currently, the version that's available online has data from the 5-year 2016 to 2020 estimates. So it's fairly current, and we expect again that that'll be updated again when the next 5-year set of data is released soon.
Okay, great. Another question that has come in, I guess it's more of a comment than a question. Someone noted that there has been a change in how the race question was asked in the 2020 census and the 2020 ACS onward, and that change may result in an increase in the population other than white. I guess they're including the American Indian Alaska Native population. So I don't know if anyone wants to say anything more about that change in the questionnaire.
Hi, everyone. This is Rachel Marks from the Census Bureau. I am the chief of the Racial Statistics branch at the Census Bureau. And I want to thank this person who made this comment for pointing out these improvements that we made to the 2020 census and also the 2020 ACS. We made a lot of improvements both to the question, also our processing and our coding, and specifically for the American Indian and Alaska Native population. We added new examples to the questionnaire to help solicit responses for that population. And we also, we increased the amount of data that we collected for each write-in line. So it's really important for the American Indian Alaska Native population that tend to have longer write-in responses. Previously, we only collected 30 characters. Now we collect up to 200 characters in each write-in line. So some tribal responses may have been cut off, particularly if they were reporting more than one tribe in previous data collections. So now we're very happy with the ability to collect up to 200 responses. So we have a lot of materials on our website that describe these changes, but I think these are really positive improvements, and we have the ability to collect more accurate data for the American Indian and Alaska Native population.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Maybe a question for you, Xana. Somebody asked what the IPUMS is all about and what that is.
And it sounds like Lillian offered to put in a link, and so that might be a good opportunity as well. So this is microdata, so it's looking at a smaller subset of the sample that responded to the ACS and kind of getting to do some of your own calculations on row level. You like pick your row level and column variables. And so there's some really great tools online that you can kind of manipulate some of the ACS data to answer the more specific questions that you're interested in. And specifically for the data I presented, I did it all using their online tools. And so I didn't have to pull it into a statistical software, which is another way to manipulate and look at that data.
Thanks. Someone asked about what the Census Bureau might be doing to build promotion or awareness for the ACS. Is there some way to offer people some kind of incentive to complete the survey? And I know that there have been some challenges with some American Indian populations in getting them to respond. So maybe, I don't know if Jim or somebody from the Census Bureau wants to say something about those challenges or what's being done to address that.
Well, I guess I could just mention briefly, and we did this for the decennial, and we're now talking with funders about potentially doing this for the ACS. During the decennial, we actually incentivized people to fill out their 2020 census form by having an electronic gift card that would be available that they could use to buy groceries with. And what it was we sent it out embedded in that it would take them directly to the link to the Census Bureau, so they would put in their code, and then it would generate a response back to back to us indicating that the census survey had been completed and that the gift card could be activated. And we found it was a really popular program because it basically told people that, we view this as very, very important. It's so important, and your time is important too. But because it's so important to your community, that we want to recognize the fact that you filled this out and provide that incentive. There have been a number of other similar sorts of incentives that have been offered in Indian country, and I know that we just had a conversation last week or earlier this week during one of the convenings of one of our national partners with the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, specifically focusing on the possibility of having private funders come in and replicate some of those incentives that were really effective during the 2020 census.
Great, thanks, Jim. I don't see any other questions that have come in at the moment, but I wondered if somebody could, one just came in for you, Xana. In using the IPUMS data in tribal areas, do you notice larger margins of error for that group?
Yes, as a short answer. I think it depends on how small of a geographic area you're looking at in terms of the population size. So I think for some reservations that have larger populations, you might see smaller margins of error versus maybe a reservation that has a smaller population, a larger margin of error. But certainly, like looking at a reservation geography, it's going to have larger margins of error than looking at like the whole state. But the margins of error are available to kind of look at and assess for yourself the quality of the data.
Thank you. I wonder if someone could speak to the special population estimates, the tables that come out every 5 years for this population. The Census Bureau just recently, I think, announced the tentative schedule for the next release next spring, 2023. Can someone say something more about those data?
This is Rachel again. I can talk a little bit more about those data products. So this is the American Indian Alaska Native special population tables. They're released every 5 years. using the 5-year ACS data products. And you're correct that we did just recently announce that we'll be releasing this using the 2020 ACS next spring and spring of 2023. And this file is really incredible because it includes data characteristics for populations that meet a threshold, I believe, of 100. And so it includes a lot of characteristics about all of the tribes. And really the purpose of this file when we first created it was to replace the characteristics that used to be on the census. So tribes used to get a lot of detailed characteristics about language spoken at home, educational attainment, health insurance. So all of the characteristics that usually they are used to getting from the ACS that maybe a tribe might not be large enough to get those characteristics for in the 1-year file, that's where these data are going to be available.
Great, thanks, Rachel. I don't see any other questions that have come in. If anybody has any final questions, please type them into the question box in your control panel. Are there any other comments or anything else from our panelists? Anyone from the Census Bureau? Anything that we didn't talk about that we should?
And Mark, I guess I want to reiterate a point that Charles made. So for the 4 tribal relations specialists, Charles, Jessica, Shadana, and the soon-to-be announced 4th person, our goal and our hope, and I hate to say this, Charles, but our goal and our hope is to make you really rack up your frequent flyer miles and to put lots of miles on your vehicles traveling out to the communities. It's a lot. It's a big ask because obviously we have 4 people that are covering, almost 600 tribes, almost 600 federally recognized tribes, and that's a lot. That's a lot to do and a lot to ask, but it's so welcome that we actually have you and that we're able to use you for the ACS. And so I want to encourage everyone watching this to please look at the map that's in my presentation, identify who the specialist is for your area, and to please reach out to them and invite them to come to your community and really speak and work with them on improving the ACS, because it's an invaluable resource and we're so lucky to have them.
Great, thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. This is Charles again. I would encourage anyone that wants to, especially our tribal partners that are listening, that wants to learn more about any of the resources that are available from the Census Bureau, not only data, but we have mapping resources available. Please contact us and we'd be glad to meet with you, as I said, either in person or virtually.
Excellent. Well, with that, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the Census Bureau experts who joined. I really appreciate everybody taking the time today, sharing your expertise. As I mentioned, we will be sharing the link to the recording for this presentation as well as the slides, hopefully by early next week. And stay tuned. We do plan to have schedule more webinars on special topics over the summer. So we hope to see many of you later this year. And with that, I think that concludes today's webinar. Jim, Zana, thanks again for joining. Really appreciate it. Everyone else, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.